Have you ever imagined lying silently in a hospital bed, unable to move, unable to open your eyes, but still able to hear every word spoken around you? Now picture being a billionaire in that situation, someone who had spent his entire life building an empire, earning respect, power, and wealth beyond imagination, only to suddenly fall into what everyone thought was a coma. People assumed he was gone, or at least no longer aware of the world, but deep inside, his mind was very much alive. That's exactly where this story begins, with Charles Davenport. A man whose name was etched into the skyline through glass towers and corporate empires. The world saw him as a titan, ruthless in boardrooms, untouchable in negotiations. And yet here he was, a prisoner of his own body. Nurses, doctors, and even family members entered his private suite in the hospital every day, thinking he couldn't hear them. But Charles could. He heard it all. The whispers about inheritance, the sighs of impatience, subtle judgments, and above all, the confessions that people only dared to speak when they thought he was locked away in darkness. At first, he found it amusing. It was almost like spying on his own world, a vantage point no billionaire could buy. But then something happened that shook him to the core. His nurse, a woman named Angela, who had always seemed so kind and professional, leaned in one night during the late shift and whispered words that changed everything. She thought she was talking to an unconscious man, but Charles heard every trembling word, and his world would never be the same after that moment. Davenport had always been the kind of man who never truly trusted anyone, not even those closest to him. Years of climbing to the very top of the business world had taught him that loyalty was often nothing more than a transaction waiting for a better bidder. Yet lying motionless in that sterile white room, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed like an orchestra of impending doom, he discovered just how fragile human connections really were. The first few days of being trapped inside his body had been torturous. He could hear the echo of doctors murmuring clinical updates. He could sense his family's impatience growing when visiting hours felt more like a duty than genuine care. But it was the nurses who painted the truest picture of the world outside his frozen shell. He learned which of them treated him as a chore, who spoke kindly even when no one was watching, and who let resentment slip into their tone. Among them, Angela stood out. She wasn't like the others. Her voice carried warmth, not just for him, but for every patient she touched. She'd hum softly while adjusting his fore. She'd clean his hands gently as though he were still a man of flesh and pride, rather than a lifeless figure in a gown. For days her kindness had been his only anchor in a storm of isolation. But it was one particular evening, when the hospital's fluorescent lights flickered under the strain of the backup generator, that Angela's demeanor shifted. Charles felt her linger by his bedside longer than usual. He could hear the creak of the chair as she settled beside him, the faint rustle of her uniform as she leaned closer. Her sigh carried a heaviness that Charles had never noticed before. And then, as though the walls of the room had become her confessional booth, she spoke words that pierced him more deeply than any corporate betrayal he had ever endured. "I know you can't hear me, Mr. Davenport," she began, her voice trembling but steady enough to reveal conviction. "But I need to tell someone, anyone, what's been weighing on me. Maybe it's crazy, but I feel safe talking to you." Charles' heart raced inside his immobile chest. She didn't know. She thought he was gone, unreachable, and that gave her the freedom to pour out a truth that would have remained buried otherwise, Angela continued, her words spilling faster now, as though she had been bottling them for years. She confessed to things that sounded far removed from the world of sterile hallways and patient charts. She spoke of her childhood, of growing up in poverty, of how she had clawed her way into nursing school by working 2 jobs and barely sleeping. She admitted that sometimes she resented the wealthy, especially men like him, who seemed to own the world while people like her were invisible. "But you're not what I expected," she whispered. "I don't know why, but when I look at you lying there, I don't see the billionaire everyone else talks about. I see a man who's human. And that scares me, because I've done things I can't take back. And if you knew, you'd hate me." Charles' mind spun. Syllable, every confession felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place, forming a picture he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a nurse venting about life. It was something more. There was guilt in her tone, sharp and undeniable, the kind that weighed heavier than mere regret. Angela's voice quivered as she recounted one night years ago when desperation had driven her to a choice she had buried ever since. She confessed to stealing from a former patient not money, but documents. Information she didn't fully understand at the time, but had handed over to a man who promised her quick cash. That man, she admitted in a trembling breath, had later been tied to one of Davenport's biggest corporate scandals. Charles nearly would have gasped if his body had obeyed him. It suddenly made sense. An inside breach, confidential reports. That had mysteriously leaked, deals collapsing overnight, and rivals gaining ground. He had spent years hunting for the source, believing it was a high-level mole. Now here she was, unknowingly confessing her role to the very man she had wronged. Angela's confession didn't stop there. She spoke of her fear every time. She saw his name on the news, of the guilt that twisted inside her, knowing she had contributed, in some indirect way, to his downfall in that moment of scandal. She had used the money to save her brother from a debt that might have cost him his life. But the price she paid was eternal shame. I told myself it was just one mistake, one desperate decision, she murmured, wiping her eyes. But fate is cruel, isn't it? Out of all the patients in this hospital, they put me in charge of the one man I betrayed. Her words broke into sobs, raw and unguarded, and Charles felt a strange mixture of rage and fascination flooding his mind. He had built his empire on reading people, on understanding their motives, yet this revelation cut deeper than any market loss. She wasn't his rival, nor a boardroom adversary. She was a woman who had carried her guilt in silence, never expecting her secret audience to awaken within. As the clock ticked past midnight, Angela steadied her breath, perhaps embarrassed by her own vulnerability. She leaned closer once more and whispered, "If you ever wake up, I'll quit. I'll disappear before you can recognize me. But for now, thank you for listening." Then she stood, adjusted his blanket with the same gentle care she always had, and left the room as though nothing had happened. But Charles was left reeling in the prison of his silence. His mind was a storm, part fury at the betrayal, part empathy for her desperation, and part curiosity about what more she might reveal if she thought he remained her voiceless confidant. For the first time since slipping into his charade of a coma, Charles realized that this facade could become more than just a retreat from the greedy hands of his family. It could become his most powerful tool, a window into truths people never dared to show when they thought he was watching. And Angela, unknowingly, had just opened the door to a revelation that would change not only his perception of her, but his entire plan for what came next. The hours after, Angela's confession became some of the longest Charles had ever endured. His body remained lifeless, locked in that suffocating stillness, but his mind was on fire. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and crushed competition now found himself with only one weapon left: his silence. And strangely, that silence was proving to be more powerful than any financial deal he had ever orchestrated. As dawn crept in through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the hospital floor, Charles replayed Angela's every word in his mind. The idea that this woman, this seemingly ordinary nurse, had once held a thread that unraveled part of his empire was staggering. He had spent fortunes on investigators, interrogated executives, even torn apart his own friendships trying to root out betrayal, and all along the secret had been tucked away in the conscience of a woman who now wiped his brow and whispered apologies when no one else could hear. But Charles was not a man who wallowed in defeat. If Angela's slip of the tongue had given him one truth, perhaps there were others waiting to be uncovered. Maybe his family, his so-called allies, even the medical staff around him, perhaps. They all had secrets. And as long as they believed he was locked away in a coma, he had the perfect vantage point to collect every one of them. That thought grew roots inside him until it became a plan. He would wait, he would listen, and he would piece together the hidden map of loyalties, betrayals, and schemes that swirled around him like vultures circling above a dying beast. His fake coma, which had initially been a calculated test of loyalty, had now evolved into something grander. This was espionage at its most personal. Already he recalled moments that had passed before Angela's confession, his eldest son Richard, speaking in hushed tones about accelerating inheritance proceedings. His business partner, Malcolm, taking calls by his bedside that hinted at plans to dismantle projects Charles had built. Even his wife, Evelyn, letting slip her exhaustion and resentment, saying she was tired of living in his shadow. These fragments of conversation had seemed petty at the time, background noise in his theater of silence. But now, with Angela's confession sparking his determination, Charles realized every whisper, every sigh, every careless remark might hold the key to understanding who truly stood by him and who waited like a snake in the grass. Angela returned for her morning rounds as if nothing had happened, her uniform crisp, her hair neatly tied back, her face wearing that professional calm nurses are trained to perfect. But Charles could hear the hesitation in her footsteps, the subtle weight of guilt dragging in her movements. She spoke kindly as she always did, checking his vitals, smoothing his sheets, humming softly under her breath. Yet beneath her routine, he caught the tremor of someone carrying a heavy secret, and that knowledge gave him a sense of control he had missed for so long. He wasn't helpless, not truly. He was gathering, calculating, playing the longest game of his life. And Angela had unknowingly become both his confessor and his pawn. The following nights were a revelation. Angela seemed drawn to his silence like a moth to a flame, returning time and again during the loneliest hours of her shift. Each night she shared more, not realizing that every syllable landed like ink on the ledger of his mind. She spoke of her struggles paying off medical debts, of her brother's downward spiral into gambling, of how she sometimes wondered if the world was designed only for people like Charles, while others like her were forced to scrape the bottom. But she also confessed her admiration for his resilience, how she had read about his rise from nothing. A black man in a world that had never welcomed him easily. A man who had clawed his way past prejudice and doubt to sit on top of the financial ladder. "Maybe that's why it hurts more that I betrayed you," she whispered one night, her voice breaking, "'cause you were proof that people like me could still fight and win." Those words struck something inside Charles that went beyond business, beyond anger. For the first time, he began to see Angela not as just a guilty nurse, but as a mirror of his own past struggles. Twisted by desperation into mistakes she could never erase. Still, empathy did not erase strategy. Charles knew that compassion and cunning could exist side by side. If he was to reclaim his empire and unmask the truth about those around him, he needed to remain vigilant. He memorized every confession, every careless conversation around his bed. He noticed how Richard visited less frequently, always glancing at his watch as though time with his father was cutting into some greater agenda. He noted how Evelyn began to entertain long phone calls outside his room, her laughter tinged with something dangerously close to flirtation with a man whose voice Charles faintly recognized as Malcolm's. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic, a web, tightening around him while they all believed he was powerless. And in a way, he smiled inside. Let them underestimate him. Let them think he was blind and deaf to their schemes. The longer he lay still, the more they revealed, and the more powerful his eventual awakening would be. Angela, unknowingly, became his anchor. Though she carried guilt, she also carried honesty, the kind that slipped out in hushed tones when the world was asleep. Charles began to sense that her confessions were not just about guilt, but about seeking redemption. She wanted to unburden herself, to be forgiven by a man she thought would never respond. And though he raged internally at her past betrayal, a part of him began to understand her humanity. She was flawed just like him, and in that flaw lay the possibility of something greater. He wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but he was ready to use her honesty to shape the storm he planned to unleash when the time came. Because Charles Davenport wasn't just a billionaire lying in a hospital bed. He was a predator biding his time, sharpening his claws in silence. And the world, his family, his enemies, and even Angela herself had no idea that the man they thought was locked away in a coma was listening, learning, and planning his most ruthless comeback yet. Days turned into weeks, and Charles Davenport found himself adjusting to his strange role as both participant and spectator in his own life. His body remained a cage, but his mind sharpened like a blade with each whispered conversation and careless confession that drifted into his room. He had learned long ago in business that information was the most valuable currency, and now he was richer than ever, not in dollars but in secrets. Every breath, every sigh, every muttered remark that people thought went unheard became another coin in his growing vault of leverage. Angela's visits became the highlight of his nights. She still carried guilt, still spoke softly into the shadows, unburdening herself to the man she thought would never judge her. But Charles was no longer content to simply listen. His instincts screamed for action, for strategy, for some way to test her sincerity and to see if she could be something more than just a guilty figure confessing into the void. He needed to know whether Angela could be trusted, whether she could become an ally in the storm he was preparing. And so, though he could not speak, though he could not rise from his bed, Charles began to experiment with the only tools left. At his disposals, deliberate movements that could easily be mistaken for involuntary reflexes. One evening, when Angela leaned close to adjust his foreline, he summoned every ounce of strength to twitch his fingers ever so slightly. It was a monumental effort, a war between his willpower and the stiffness of a body that had grown accustomed to stillness. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing, just a muscle spasm. But Angela froze. Her eyes flicked to his hand, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she seemed to doubt what she saw, then she shook her head and whispered, "Just my imagination." But Charles had seen the flicker of hope in her expression, the way her heart leaped at the thought that he might not be as far gone as everyone believed. That was the confirmation he needed. Angela didn't want him trapped forever. Despite her guilt, despite her past betrayal, some part of her longed for his return. That longing could be shaped, guided, even weaponized. He tried again the following night, this time a faint movement of his lips, as though some word were trapped inside. Angela gasped quietly, leaning closer, whispering, "Mr. Davenport? Did you?" "No, it can't be." She brushed her fingers gently over his hand. And though Charles could not respond further, he felt the warmth of her touch linger, filled with both fear and fragile hope. For the first time, she left his room unsettled, glancing over her shoulder, as though guarding a secret. And Charles knew then that she would not reveal what she had seen, not to the doctors, not to the other nurses, not to his family. She wanted to keep it to herself, whether out of fear or out of some strange need to maintain her confessional bond with him. That silence made her invaluable. Meanwhile, his family grew bolder in their selfishness. Richard visited less and less, and when he did, his conversations were transactional, filled with impatience. He spoke with lawyers in hushed tones about the logistics of transferring control of assets, about liquidating investments before they rotted under old age. His wife Evelyn, once elegant and devoted, now carried an aura of restlessness. She would sit beside his bed, staring at his face as though measuring how much longer she had to endure the charade of being the loyal spouse. On more than one occasion, Charles overheard her speaking softly into her phone, her words dripping with laughter she had not shared with him in years. The man on the other end was unmistakably Malcolm, his business partner. The betrayal stung, like acid in his veins. It wasn't just infidelity, it was collusion. Together, Evelyn and Malcolm plotted not just to replace him, but to reshape everything he had built into something that served their desires. Each revelation fueled Charles' determination. In his younger years, he had fought against systemic prejudice, against the dismissive glares of men who told him he didn't belong in the world of power. He had risen above them, step by step, turning every slight into fuel. Now, lying in that hospital bed, he felt that same fire returning. The challenge was different, but the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about legacy, about proving that he was not a relic waiting to be buried. He would not allow his empire to be stolen by greedy heirs and traitorous partners. And Angela, whether she realized it or not, had become the key to this battle. She was the only one who had shown him a side of herself unfiltered, raw, and painfully human. Her confession had cracked open the door to a strange kind of trust. Charles intended to push it further. The next test came in the form of vulnerability. One night, when Angela sat in her usual chair, sighing deeply as though weighed down by the world, Charles forced his body into another small act of rebellion. This time, he let a single tear slip from the corner of his eye. Angela gasped sharply, covering her mouth with her hand, staring at him as though witnessing a miracle. She whispered his name again and again, her voice trembling, tears welling in her own eyes. "You're in there, aren't you? You can hear me." She gripped his hand tightly, her confession pouring out faster now, her guilt mixing with newfound hope. She begged his forgiveness for what she had done years ago, promising that if he ever woke, she would make it right, that she would dedicate herself to helping him recover.